The language that's used on this is deceptive. It actually is the most egregious example that I know of in my lifetime of just flat out saying what's not true.
Welcome to Breakpoint this week. On behalf of the Colson Center, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. We have so much to talk about today, John, but I have to ask you a question. Are you a coffee guy? I realize I don't know this about you.
Yeah, I absolutely am. In fact, I'm speaking for those that are watching the video here and see this cool new backdrop. This is not a new backdrop. It's I'm with my friends at Impact 360, and I walk in this morning, and they're like, "Would you like some coffee?" And I said, "Sure." It's like, "Do you want the coffee or do you want the pour over?" You know.
Oh, bro.
And I found, yeah, I know, and I definitely took the pour over, but I was thankful to Sean McDowell, who apparently is a diva, who actually asked for it first. So that's where it all came from.
That's very special. So I am a coffee person as well. I mean, I'm not as pretentious as a pour-over person per se, but this week I've been experimenting because I can't seem to find the right amount. This is my problem. So I either drink so much that I become like a schizophrenic person, and like my wall is covered in newspaper with like red lines drawn, you know, with connections, like I'm in
like
overdrive,
a beautiful mind,
like
yeah,
a beautiful
I got it.
mind. Mm-hmm. Or it's like 2 p.m. and I put my kids down for a nap and I take a nap with them. Like I just cannot find a happy medium. So if you have any suggestions, John, or anybody listening, please let me know. Help me find my medium. I don't know what to do about this.
Well, this sounds like a personal problem.
It is a person. Isn't that what this is for, though? I feel like you're...
This is not that show. There are shows that are about, you know, how to have your best life now and coffee and everything else, but that's not really not what Breakpoint this week is really about.
I think that's what it is, John. I think you're missing it. I think that's really what it is. And I consider you my personal guru. That's why I saved these questions for this time.
Oh, boy. Yeah, you're doomed.
I know. That's so true. Okay, we should get into it. We actually do have a lot to talk about today. So the first thing we want to talk about, we actually started, when we were talking about this week, we thought, let's not wade into this stuff in Georgia because this is it seems like such a quagmire and it seems so political in nature. But it's risen to such a fever pitch that we decided it really is worth talking about for a couple of reasons. Not necessarily the technicalities of the law and the political side of it, but where it's gone in a cultural sense. So what happened, if you missed this story, is Georgia passed a new law. I think it was last week or maybe the week before. But they passed a new law with some new restrictions and some expansions of voting in that state. And restrictions, not so much on the way voting used to be pre-pandemic, but so during the pandemic, a lot of states set up ballot boxes around the state where you could drop off your ballots instead of having to show up at a polling place. And this law in Georgia, I think, cut down the number of ballot boxes, for example, and whereas they had never had them before. They also said people cannot hand out like water or fans or something like that while people are waiting in line to vote. But they also said that if people are waiting in line for longer than an hour, then polling places have to make some changes. They have to basically set up it logistically so people aren't waiting that long. It changed the ID requirements for mail-in voting, for absentee voting, where you can, they're no longer going to be doing a signature match because they felt like that was just a shot in the dark. So now you have to just write down your social security number or your driver's license number or your state ID number. And I don't even think it's your full social. You can just do the last four. You don't have to send in a copy of it. There's a lot of technical stuff here, but the reaction to it was very strong. And in some ways, it was already hitting a fever pitch in Georgia because the election results there of the presidential election were so contentious and there was allegations of fraud, which didn't come to fruition. But a lot of people are really upset about this law, and most notably, President Biden called it Jim Crow 2.0, I think, or Jim Crow of the new millennium. And then the bigger reaction from corporate America was that the Major League Baseball, which was going to have its All-Star game in Atlanta this year, which was also going to honor Hank Aaron at this All-Star game in Atlanta, they decided they're going to move it to a different state. And I think they chose your home state of Colorado. But they said they're doing that.
They chose Colorado.
Yeah, in opposition to this bill. So And then following suit, Delta Airlines, a couple other Coca-Cola, a couple other companies based in Georgia came out and have said, they don't agree with the law. So just a lot going on. What was your feeling on the reaction to this?
This is just kind of a case in point of so many other things that we've talked about for so many weeks. I mean, first of all, I think the primary thing being kind of the woke capitalism and the pressure that corporations can have on states. And this is something that we have seen at a level over the last couple of years that outpaces anything in terms of corporate activism or, being, sustainable or any of the other buzzwords that are used for corporate America being kind of having a conscience. This is just the amount of pressure to take a political side is really significant. The second thing is that this activism is being done largely on talking points that right now, at least in this case, don't always meet the evidence. In this case, doesn't meet the evidence. There's nothing particularly nefarious about the way that this legislation has come through. There were some concerns over the way this was handled in Georgia. This should be expected when so many changes were made going into a pandemic year election cycle, and then having to come on the other side and go, well, listen, let's kind of, let's hold tight and let's look again at what we did and see if it was wise and see if it was, if there were any big problems and things like that. But it was as if like Georgia Republicans, went back to the Jim Crow era. That was the accusation of the president to come up with these restrictions that are certainly a part of American history in certain times and certain places. Now, what they did is they went to New York and took laws that are already in the books on places like New York and put them here. So my point is not to say whether these particular policies were good ones or bad ones, but that the narrative that was advanced culturally doesn't meet the facts. And because it was done the way that it was done, corporate America was able to be handcuffed and hijacked to the cause. And that's just really a troubling thing because of the power then the culture has to push a narrative. I spent all morning speaking to a group of students here in Georgia, and we were just talking about in an age of information, how an age of information like ours becomes an age of competing authorities. The question of trustworthiness, who's telling us the truth, and how do we know, is just a very, very difficult question because, in other words, somebody that can hijack a headline very quickly can dominate what we believe about this. I mean, millions of Americans still think that Sarah Palin said that she can see Russia from her house. She never did. This was a headline. And this is not Jim Crow on steroids, which is what I think Joe Biden said. This is Neil Postman on steroids. This is the power of the narrative to be kind of hijacked and controlled. And it's a challenge for Christians who want to not live by lies, and it's a challenge for Christians who want to proclaim truth, because both of those things are made far more difficult in a culture like ours, where basically people just say things that aren't true as if they are, and then the conversation's over.
That's what I found really scary about it. It reminded me of a situation, this is a very small thing, but a couple of years ago, I used to write news roundups for iHeartMedia. So I helped them write their news roundups for various cities that would play on like AM radio in the mornings. And I came across a story out of a state, I couldn't even tell you what state it was, but it was a legislative story. And it involved a specific state legislator. And the way that this story spelled his name, as I was reading it, I was like, there's no way that's the correct spelling. It was unpronounceable. So I went to the state government's website and found the correct spelling of this guy's name. And sure enough, this small story in a local newspaper had spelled it wrong. But I found the same story in maybe 3 or 4 other publications, and they all repeated the spelling error. They had copied it clearly from the first story. I think it was the AP or a Newswire that had written the first story. And it was kind of alarming. Again, this was a small story. I don't even remember what it was. But that happens on a large scale. And I think we're seeing something like that happening here now. Somebody found a narrative in this story and they ran with it and they said something, and the thing they said got repeated. And it was, in this case, it's so egregious and so illogical. I think I agree with you. This is a a wake-up call for Christians and even non-Christians who want to be aware of what's really going on. If you're hearing stories like this about a legislation that's passed, my best recommendation is go to the actual legislation. Go to the state's website and read the actual legislation, because I know there used to be a time where you could listen to news broadcasts and they would tell you what it was, but I don't know what to say except that that time is over. The other strange thing about this, John, is that there's a part of it that seems like people want this kind of thing to be true.
Right.
We've mentioned this before, where it feels like we're treating it like good news. Look at these oppressors that want to oppress you. Who wants that to be true? If you have to grasp at so many straws to paint the picture that it is, it begs the question, why? Why are you doing that? What do you make of that psychologically or sociologically? Why do people want things like this to be true?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge in the information age. And so much of this, we spend a lot of time writing about this in A Practical Guide to Culture, because people forget that this move that we have made into what's called the information age from, maybe a previous age of industry or whatever is dramatic. And it affects so many areas of our lives, not only personally, and not only just in terms of where we get our news, but just our whole psychological makeup and what we value. I mean, all of this stuff gets dramatically impacted. And you can actually see now, as people have looked back on the Industrial Revolution, how much changed as the world went from, highly agricultural to, to a more industry-centric sort of place, just how many aspects of our lives were affected. I think we're just kind of in the middle of this. It's kind of like this tsunami wave that when you're in it, it doesn't feel like a tsunami because you're not getting pounded on it, but you're being moved miles and miles and miles away from where you ever were. And this is one of those examples. And for example, I think folks are going to be hearing this, and many political conservatives are going to be like, yeah, those people are saying what's not true and that sort of stuff. And then in 3 minutes, are going to turn around and share a story with a conservative headline that's not true. And because this isn't a we might be able to, at some point, I don't know how we would possibly do this, add up all the stories, that have a conservative bent or a liberal bent. And certainly we know what's going to, be the total if we're looking at mainstream sources, and then we know what's going to be the total if we're looking. And we can say, well, which ones are true and which ones are just basically people sharing their pre-existing bias. The fact of the matter is that discernment is a remarkably hard thing to foster and cultivate in this particular cultural moment. But I said this morning, and I really believe it. The answer isn't to get our narrative over somebody else's narrative. The answer is to get an ability to identify what's true and expose what's evil and expose what's wrong. Discernment is essential. To not have discernment is to be brainwashed. Sometimes to have discernment is to be brainwashed. I mean, it's just when you're talking about just being pounded day in and day out by media, by entertainment, by messages and social media and every other place. It's the task to say what is true, to not live by lies, I think is a lot harder than many of us actually think. And, the many of us that think we're being discerning sometimes can also be kind of carried away because something meets our pre-existing bias. The talking point for Christians is to double down on this thing that Paul prayed for the church at Philippi, that our love would abound more and more in truth and discernment. You have love, you have truth, you have discernment. I don't think you can have any of those things without the other.
Agreed. Greg Stier talked about that a little bit this week on our short course. We're talking about how to speak the truth in love. And he talked about that, and I think that's relevant here. It would be easy to respond to people in Georgia, for example, who are just wringing their hands over this law and feel angry. Why are you believing these lies? Like, why aren't you looking yourself? And that sort of thing. But I think the most helpful and Christian response to something like this is to say, okay, yes, this would be really concerning if that's what was really happening, right? But let's talk about this together. Let's look at what is actually happening. Unfortunately, when things like Major League Baseball and major companies come out like this, the case for the wrong interpretation of the bill gets stronger. And what's really sad about that, too, and a little scary, is that it's starting to feel like there's no corner of culture you can run to where these sort of lies that are running amok, but also politicization of things is not there. My husband would just was just feeling heavy this week over this. Baseball is his thing. He gets really into it every year. He loves it. And one of the things, he doesn't hardly watch TV anymore because everything feels so loaded and emotional and weighty. Baseball is his one thing. And he said to me, it feels like I can't have this anymore. And not so much that he was angry at Major League Baseball, but he felt like I don't think they want conservative fans. Like, I don't know how to interpret this sort of thing anymore. And that's difficult to deal with.
Yeah, there's been so many stories over the last couple of weeks, and maybe we're going to get to one later on. I can't remember, but about how the religiosity is going down in America, at least commitments. We can talk about the growth of the nuns and all of that. And many people have recognized, I think G.K. Chesterton maybe at first, is that, listen, the loss of religion, religious commitment, and religious identification is always replaced with something else. And what we have now is the political sphere taking over so many other spheres as those spheres become less and less important or essential in people's lives. I mean, politics is the only thing left that can solve problems. Politics is the only thing, or that's seen to be able to solve problems. Politics is the only proper way to tell whether someone's a good person or a bad person. Why? Well, when you lose moral absolutes, what other categories do you actually have? I appreciated, for example, Marco Rubio this week and many others, but he was one of them who challenged, the Major League Baseball. And was like, look, you're going to pull out of Georgia. When are you going to pull out of China? China's literally committing genocide, literally putting people in concentration camps, literally taking their hair and selling them as beauty products, literally forcing labor, literally forcing sterilization, it's just kind of forcing abortion. I mean, you just go down the line, and what the Muslim and what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to the Uyghur population in the Xinjiang province is, the stuff that we read about in history and say never again. And Major League Baseball is still quite cozy with the Chinese government. And that's what you see, is that this isn't based on any sort of moral framework that is consistent or absolute. It's what happens when the political sphere takes over so many others as those other spheres become thinner and thinner and thinner.
And that's the nasty irony of this sort of thing, is that people do this and they couch it in terms that say, I'm standing up for you, I'm doing this to help you, I'm doing this to help the oppressed. And they're just taking them for a total ride. They are lying to them. And that's the most dehumanizing and cruel and patronizing and condescending thing you can do to a person, is to lie to them, and not only lie, but lie to them in a way that teaches them that they're being oppressed. Lie to them about something that's going to cause them pain. And that's what Major League Baseball is doing to people in Georgia by suggesting this is going to hold you down and I'm going to stand up for you, when it's clear that they don't, like you're saying, they don't hold those morals. Major League Baseball just signed a deal this week with Tencent, which is the broadcasting arm of the Chinese Communist Party in China, to allow Major League Baseball games to be broadcast there. And this is the same communications company that shut off NBA, or shut off just the Houston Rockets games last year after the Houston Rockets coach sent a tweet in favor of democracy in Hong Kong. We're not even talking about the Uyghurs. We're talking about democracy in Hong Kong. This company shut off the games because of that tweet, and MLB just signed a deal with them this week. So if you feel like the MLB is on your side, they're taking you for a ride. That was an unfortunate rhyme, but it's true. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint this week with John Stonestreet and Maria Baer. We're going to take a quick break. We have a lot more to talk about this week. We'll be right back. Well, we're back with more Breakpoint this week. I'm Maria Baer alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. We have a lot more to talk about this week. So, John, kind of switching gears here, but not too far. We were just talking about the voting law in Georgia and the misinformation and the way people are lying about it, and how that's spreading. I want to talk now about what's going on in Arkansas, and I think there's some similarities here. The biggest one being lies and the way lies spread and the way we depend on lies. So there was a bill, the Arkansas legislature put up a bill that would have banned transgender surgery and hormone treatment for minors under the age of 18 in Arkansas. And to most people's surprise, including mine, Governor Asa Hutchison, who's a Republican, vetoed the bill. He said which I find this deeply ironic. He said it was too extreme. He said it went too far. It didn't grandfather in people who were already getting treatment, and that he felt that it was not appropriately small government minded, that it got in between people and their doctors and the relationship there. Thankfully, the legislature then overrode his veto. In Arkansas, you can override a governor's veto with a simple majority, I believe, in the legislature. So they overrode it, and this will become law. But Governor Hutchinson's reaction to the bill was surprising and difficult to follow logically. The AP and USA Today, I thought this was interesting as well. They characterized the bill, as did most other news outlets, as a bill to ban gender-confirming treatments and surgery for transgender youth. And I saw other news outlets refer to it as banning health care for transgender people, which this gets to what we were talking about in Georgia about lying to people about something that will scare them. I don't know if they mean to suggest that if a transgender person gets the flu, they're not going to be treated. I know they weren't, I know that that's not true, but that to say that this is banning healthcare for trans people, that, somebody could walk away believing that. So this is really a startling situation. And John, I know you, like me, are kind of tired of talking about some of these trans issues, but this kind of stuff just keeps happening, and the pressure keeps building, it looks like, on Republicans like Asa Hutchison.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of those issues where very quickly Christians are going to find themselves out of step with any political party. The more we have seen, where the primary loyalties lie for state governments, which oftentimes is financial, and so when the corporate pressure comes, it's very hard to stand strong. I want to just commend real quickly, and this is going to be odd because we don't usually commend folks who are just kind of political news folks, but over the last couple of weeks, both with the situation with South Dakota Governor Noem and Governor Hutchinson here from Arkansas, Tucker Carlson has had both of them on and has refused to allow the talking points to let them get away with the talking points that so often characterize what they say. So, for example, this idea that it's too extreme. Let me just point out a couple things, because you're right, I am tired of talking about this. Let me point out a couple things. The first thing is why is it the case that limitations on treatments that physically interfere with natural normal development or that cause perpetual lifelong wounds, that's what's called extreme. This is the classic thing we talk about where that ideas are smuggled into the meaning of words. Transgender surgery is literally wounding someone who is physically healthy, with the promise that is also, as Tucker Carlson pointed out to Governor Hutchinson in no uncertain terms this week, and it was actually very impressive, with the promise that it's going to fix things, and the science and the numbers and the reviews do not show at all that folks are fixed, especially when you're talking about people who are under the age of adulthood. In fact, what we find is that the vast majority will come to identify with their biological sex if given enough time and given enough help. So the language of calling this, just think about this, gender-confirming treatments. No, this is treatment that tells someone to not confirm, but to deny what everything says about who they are biologically, except for how they feel inside. We would never say, for example, that anorexia is, weight confirming treatment. We would say it's an eating disorder. The language that's used on this is deceptive. It actually is the most egregious example that I know of in my lifetime of just flat out saying what's not true, calling wrong right and right wrong, getting them exactly backwards. And I think we have underestimated, first of all, who agrees with this, who thinks this is actually ultimately important for our understanding and affirmation of what it means to be made in the image of God. I think when it's going to be evidence for us going forward of political loyalties that precede or supersede theological truth when we're going to change our minds for political reasons or be forced to go, well, I mean, what big government? I mean, what does that mean for a government to protect children is maybe considered the most important thing that any government can do anyway. It's not big government. And the thing is to step in and to stop this stuff that is experimental, that is unscientific, where the stats do not back it up at any level, much less anything that has to do with kind of historic wisdom from Western culture or from the world, not to mention from Scripture itself. To say that that's extreme, listen, the language is being applied in the wrong direction here. And this is the only way, this goes back to what we said before, to not have discernment in this culture is to be brainwashed.
Medical practice is regulated at almost every turn, whether by ethics in the medical community or by actual law. You can't prescribe, I mean, without, some sort of supervision. You can't give 20 Percocet to a 5-year-old. There are clear standard operating procedures for all kinds of medical treatment. The argument that this somehow, in a precedent-setting way, gets in between a doctor and a patient is so disingenuous that it's hard to even repeat. I do not understand where that's coming from outside of, like you said, political pressure. And John, this is really scary. It's scary for kids, but it's also scary for the rest of people in the United States. I mean, when Governor Hutchinson was on Tucker Carlson, like you said, he said, I'm referencing the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, the American Medical Association, and he's not wrong. All of those bodies are saying this is what you should do, and they're not saying it based on evidence. They're having to ignore the evidence that you're talking about that shows that this sort of treatment does not help the mental situation that's going on. There's not a drop long term in suicidal ideation or in self-harm or in depression. And that is really terrifying. John, what I wanted to share too here is that, it made me think of several years ago, I had my appendix removed, and they did it in a new way, like the laparoscopic way, where they just make a tiny incision. And it was new at the time, at least that's what they told me. And a couple years later, I had to go see another doctor, and he was very old, super kind man. But he was doing an exam on my stomach, and he saw my tiny little scar from my appendectomy, and he said, "What's that from?" And I said, "I had my appendix out." And he said, No, that's not what that is. And I said, I was like frozen. I was like, I think they took it. I wasn't awake for it, but I'm pretty sure they took it out. It was like really hurting, and then it didn't hurt anymore. And he was like, no, that the scar for the appendectomy is usually on the other side, and I'll make a note of it and I'll double check. And I'm assuming he just wasn't familiar with the new procedure, but that feeling was very unsettling. And I didn't go back to that doctor. He was a gastroenterologist, and I found a different one. But it was sort of this wake-up call where I was like, somebody that I think is an authority and knows way more about the human body than I do, and who I need to rely on right now to help me with some sort of physical ailment, I can't, because we don't share the same, we're not looking at reality in the same way. And it was like when you realize your parents aren't superheroes. It was kind of like a hero falling moment. But it was really unsettling. And I feel the same way about this stuff. We were just talking about the consensus among the major bodies of associations of doctors and the medical community that all say that this transgender treatment, even for children, is the best course. It's really, I feel scared. I feel unsettled. It's like the emperor has no clothes and we're not willing to say it. And people with scalpels in their hands are not willing to say it. And that's really, really scary and unsettling. And I don't understand, too, how I'm really interested to know whether this is being practiced in other areas of medicine. And what I mean by that is, so take, for example, when my appendix went bad, I went to the emergency room, was in a terrible amount of pain. I was in my early 20s, not married. And the first thing they had to do when I got there was do a pregnancy test. And I raised a huge stink about this. I was on my high horse about it, partly because I wanted pain medication immediately, but they can't give certain pain medication if you're pregnant. And I was of childbearing age. Of course, I'm trying to tell them there's no humanly possible way I'm pregnant. Don't waste this time. But they have to do it, and I'm glad they do. Are you telling me that now if a man walks in and he's in terrible appendix-related pain, they're going to do a pregnancy test? Because they can't have a conversation about, does he feel like a woman today? This is what I mean. There's all kinds of other areas where your genetic makeup and your sexual organs have a lot to bear on the sort of treatment you get. It's relevant to a lot of other medical treatment. How are they treating it? And I'm very suspicious that they're treating it anything other than reality-based. In a situation where it's an emergency, someone needs their appendix out and they need pain medication, they're not running pregnancy tests on men. Yeah. Which, again, this is just disingenuous at all turns.
Well, look, when you go through the scanning machine at TSA, they have to mark whether you're a male or a female so they know whether to pat you down. And that's a system that we know has been manipulated in the city of Denver as well as others. But I don't want to get into that because our listeners get tired of hearing. Here we go. But my point is that this same ideology is creeping in and driving policy. I mean, we know this, for example, in one of the causes. I just can imagine what Chuck Colson would say about this idea of allowing men to identify as women and then be moved to the female prisons or vice versa. He would know, for example, as someone who had, campaigned actively to create systems that could stop the epidemic of prison rape. Someone who talked about, what restoration and reconciliation are and the idea of moral formation and the critical path of being able to actually know what's right and wrong at a young age and how that influences crime and all that sort of stuff, that to take something that's not true and then build policy on it could be really, dangerous. This idea, I'm pretty old, but I still remember being a junior high boy and the opportunity for a junior high boy to take advantage of policies like this. Of course, and that's also what's happening here with men who are incarcerated being allowed to identify as women and moved into female prisons. It's amazing now. We're starting to see the numbers that over 250 inmates have requested transfer to women's facilities in California. That puts an awful lot of women at risk.
Yeah, you're right, John, and that's another really alarming development in this situation. Well, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more of the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. You're listening to Breakpoint with Maria Baer and John Stonestreet. Well, we're back with more Breakpoint this week with Maria Baer and John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. John, I want to switch gears again here and talk about something you mentioned a little earlier in the program, but it's a story we've been following. And there was a poll run by Gallup a couple weeks ago that showed that for the first time since they started tracking these numbers, which I think was in the 30s, the percentage of people in America that are affiliated, so are members of a religious organization, so churches, synagogues, or mosques, has dipped below 50% for the first time. My first thought when I saw this was this is an odd time to take a poll like that. The pandemic has absolutely wreaked havoc on church attendance and membership for obvious reasons, but it's still significant. A lot of people are leaving the church. And what they found, too, is I think over half of respondents who said they weren't members anymore, they weren't just switching denominations or congregations. They were saying, I'm not affiliated with religion at all anymore. So these were the people you referred to earlier as the nuns, which I have to tell you, the first time you and I think Shane were talking about nuns, I was like women in the convent? What are they talking about? I went to a Catholic school as a kid, so I had a lot of nuns around. But this is a different kind of nun. This is None, as in nun religious affiliation. So that seems to be driving the drop in church membership as well. Obviously, there are a lot of implications here and a lot of a wrestling to do with what's causing this. What do you think is causing this?
Yeah, I think there's the question of what's causing it and then what does this mean for society. I mean, religious belief is often considered to be a personal, private thing. There's nothing further from the truth when you actually look at human history. You know, the things that have started wars and the things that have inspired, you know, incredible social change, like the end of slavery or the rights of women, or, you know, go down the line. Religious belief, religious conviction, religious affiliation, religious community. There's few things that could be identified as bigger forces in moving the needle in cultures in human history. So this is not just how many individuals have, quote unquote, you know, lost their faith or drifted away or whatever. We're talking about kind of cosmic shifts in American society. And we know this because we just have to look across the pond, you know, so to speak. I mean, there's a very, very interesting story to be told about why the Enlightenment gave birth so quickly to a secularism in Europe that reframed so much of life. Even real estate, where former, you know, churches are far more often to be pubs in certain, you know, European country than to be anything else. Sometimes mosques.
John, my church right now is an old winery.
So you've actually gone the other way. Well, my church, what's interesting is my church was a church, then became a bar called Sin. I'm not kidding, S-Y-N, and now is a church again. So we redeemed sin. So that's a whole awesome. Fun story about St. George's in Colorado Springs. But that's not the story across Europe, right? I mean, the story across Europe is a population that has stopped going to church a long time ago. And then, of course, one of the questions is, why has America been so immune to this for so long? What's in American history? And there's a lot about, you know, the First Great Awakening, the Second Awakening, the Businessmen's Revival, this kind of history of revivalism, figures like Billy Sunday and Billy Graham and everybody in between. This is really interesting stuff, but you know, if you're kind of a passive historical, sociological observer, then you're going to think, oh, this is really interesting, like me. But when you get beyond that, in terms, what does this mean in terms of marriage? What does this mean in terms of, you know, the space of government? For example, the smaller the religious conscience of a nation, the bigger the governmental footprint. That's just almost always the case. That government tends to take the place that religion leaves available. So we're seeing that sort of religious affiliation. And by the way, one of the obvious, and this is probably obvious to many people, but it's just worth saying, that it's not getting better with the younger generation. It's getting precipitously worse, right? So 58% of boomers belong to churches, 50% of Gen Xers, 36% of millennials. When you get to Gen Zers, it's going to be lower. The pandemic timing is, I think, an important point to bring out, which you said, Maria, which is, you know, what's this going to be? I think what we found is that there's far fewer people now than at the beginning of the pandemic that would remain loyal in their identifications. Whereas before it was like, yeah, I go to such and such a church and we're meeting online. You know, this is kind of weeding out those that are actually committed and those that aren't. And I think that's what I'm hearing, at least from pastors, particularly of mid-sized churches. The numbers are down. And, of course, there was this moment of hope early on where we're reaching more online than ever before. But, listen, having somebody tune in from Bulgaria is great, but it's not actually what's going to sustain a church. If you know, are in, you know, the middle of Boston, you've got to have the identity that is fostered by religious commitment. And that change of commitment is a change of identity for a group of people. That means loyalties are in other places. That means the money is going to go in other directions. That means the time is going to go in other direction. That means the deep care is going to go in other direction. It's going to be a big deal. Yeah.
I'm so distracted by you randomly bringing up Bulgaria. Like, how did you choose?
Bulgaria? You know, I was looking for something that started with the same letter of another city that came to mind.
And it's pretty good. You know. But in all seriousness,
I'm a 10th Bulgarian. That's where. No, I'm just kidding.
Are you? Oh, John.
No, I just completely made that up.
Well, I'm going to make you a cake. We're going to go all out with this.
All right.
The interesting thing about this for me, especially with the age gap, is that I feel like, now you know more about sociology than me, so correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the values of church in general, I don't mean Christian values or biblical values or worldview, but the values of church, so being a community that meets together, helping each other with their needs, you know, being others focused, that sort of thing. Those values seem to be more popular now than they were when I was a kid or when my parents were kids. I feel like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was more every man for himself, do what you want, do what makes you happy. And it's sort of getting more in vogue now to act like a church, but it's just unmoored from any Christian belief or any real reason for it. And actually, a friend of mine was telling me recently, and I looked into it, and it's bizarre, but it's true. There's something in the UK called Sunday Assembly. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, it's called Sunday Assembly. I'm reading their website now. It says, the first Sunday Assembly was started by two comedians who were on their way to a gig in Bath, which I think Bath is where Jane Austen is from. Moving on. To a gig in Bath when they discovered they both wanted to do something that was like church, but totally secular and inclusive of all, no matter what they believed. Now there are over 45 Sunday Assembly chapters in 8 different countries. These are literally people who meet together on Sunday mornings to talk about whatever they want to talk about. They'll talk about comic books or video games or whatever it is, but they just want to get together with each other on Sundays and be together. And I frankly don't know what to do with that information. Part of me thinks, what a massive failure. And I, of the cultural imagination, but also on the part of the church to sell itself for what it is. I don't know how we got here. How did we not send the message that we could be your Sunday assembly?
Well, a lot of it is this idea that we're the church that will meet your needs, and that means we're the church that requires the least amount of commitment from you, the church that requires the least amount of commitments, whether it's in belief or behavior or your time. So the seeker-friendly model flies completely in the face of a community that you actually go and you join and you contribute to. And the church has always played that role. The church also kind of losing at some level the outreach part of it. Like, we have something that everybody else needs, whether it's at some level charity or the other level, much more important, the gospel, as opposed to, come here and get your own needs met. There are a few people, we've joked about this, more evangelistic than those CrossFitters who basically treat CrossFit as a church and then want everybody else to know the benefits of them. Well, you could go down the line. I've spent the last 3 weeks, proclaiming the joy of having March Madness back again, right? I mean, this stuff kind of takes over our lives in that kind of evangelistic sense, and we feel like we have to share. But the whole church model has, in so many ways, has moved from a go and tell to a come and see. Come in and see what we're doing. Come in and see what we're doing. Well, there's no way to compete, if somebody is super into cycling with the Sunday morning biking club. For all the Sunday assemblies, by the way, that are there are millions more that just don't go by that name, but they're hobby-oriented things that people give their loyalties to. And again, when religion loses its place, something else will take its place. And a lot of times that's the state. On a personal level, it's certainly a lot of, activities.
At the same time, I worry about what happens if we ignore too much. We go too far the other direction and we ignore the people inside our church, in our actual pews. And not to say we go so far as to say we're a come and see church and we're going to make sure you enjoy yourself the whole time you're here. Mm-hmm. But I don't know how to bridge the gap between that and the alternative, because I've seen churches, especially during the pandemic, who, out of a desire to, show that we're going to take this pandemic seriously, or we're taking the racial disunity in our country seriously, or we're worried about national political issues and that sort of thing, they tend to get so wrapped up in that then they ignore the actual people in their pews. And then it doesn't feel like a church either, because out of some desire to serve like a nebulous community out there, or to speak to a community out there, we're not serving the people in here. And then it's not serving its purpose either. I don't know how to bridge that gap, because like you said, I don't want it to be, church shouldn't be a party where we all come and get a self-help talk from Brene Brown and say rah, 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 and I feel better about myself now and go home. But it also shouldn't be everybody who's in here are on the team of serving, not being served, and those are the two extremes, I think, that will lead to declines in membership, because I don't know.
Well, I don't think it needs to be a choice, certainly. And I think the other thing, there's a million things I think that are creating these numbers. There's cultural trends. There's, the move, for example, to, as we've already mentioned before, the Industrial Revolution to the information age means that so much of the material that was only available at church is widely available online. So pastors are competing with celebrity pastors. And, that stuff is kind of brand new, where, you might have always liked Tim Keller better than your pastor preaching, but you didn't have access to him until you got the podcast. And now it's like, well, we've been doing online church for a year. Why go back? There's that. I think there's also, too, we've talked before about a kind of our culture of unforgiveness, that if you're on the wrong side of this or that or the other, there's not a redeemability. And that really affects our, you and I worked together on a commentary, Breakpoint commentary, I think, several months ago, and this really came from your experience of how quickly people mark someone else off as toxic in order to move on. Because somebody so offends me, there's not a sense where I need to forgive or I need to get over this offense as a way to both bless you and to grow as a person and be better. But no, I'm just going to mark you off and walk away. And that's a very easy thing to do. In fact, one of the things that is kind of, pushing the exodus from identifying with evangelical, is exactly that. I mean, there's a movement right now called the Leave Loud movement. This has to do with the issue of race. Basically saying, white evangelicals are irredeemable in the way that they do church, and enough is enough. It's time to leave and to leave loud. We were tempted to talk about that in terms of race, but I know so many people who have left their church because of a mask mandate.
Right.
And look, I think both of these issues are huge. Like, there are plenty of white churches or predominantly white churches that mess up because on the race issue and mess up badly. And maybe there's plenty of churches that should have come down with different policies on wearing or not wearing masks. Here's the question, though. And I don't want to equate those two things, because racism is an awful, egregious, evil sin. Right. And the history of pain goes way back. Mm-hmm. And I'm white. And I will willingly admit my blind spots.
Part Bulgarian, though. I mean,
part Bulgarian. Yeah, there's my victim card. No, but I think the bigger point here is is just what's my biggest loyalty? Is my biggest loyalty to the people of God, or is my biggest loyalty to something else? What is big enough? And there's times to leave a church. We talked about this. There's times to leave relationships. But what counts? What really counts? And when am I? Well, I mean, I think that the race issue is really difficult. I'm really sad that the Leave Loud movement has basically said this is an irredeemable issue. We're not going to be able to keep fellowship with our white brothers and sisters because of this. And I'm sure many of their complaints are legitimate. But I also think, listen, we're family. Like, this is the kingdom of God. Like, we're parts of the redeemed part of body of Christ. And then I look at people who left over masks. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, that's not even that is such an observable, egregious violation of who we belong to, right? Yeah. But it does tell you what's at work here, and what's at work here underneath all of this is a ecclesiology, a theology of the church that's anemic, that just isn't biblically shaped in the way that it needs to be. Yeah.
And I've come across this Leave Loud movement as well. So this is coming from the Witness Black Christian Collective. And they've started this hashtag, and they're doing a series on their podcast where they're inviting Black Christians to come on and share their stories of leaving loud. And after listening to several of these, one of the things that has become clear to me is this is less about, it sounds like, leaving particular congregations or particular communities that have been hurtful or have become legitimately toxic. And it sounds more to me like we're talking about leaving a faith tradition altogether, which is a red flag to me, because to use the people in a situation to justify leaving a faith tradition, so leaving a set of truth claims, just doesn't follow. I don't discard the science of chemistry because my chemistry teacher was a jerk. And obviously that's not a perfect analogy. Chemistry isn't a science that's supposed to change your heart, and Christianity is. And if you see people in your church whose hearts don't appear to be changing, I could understand the desire to leave. But to throw out a set of truth claims and then pretend it was because people didn't act the way you wanted them to feels disingenuous. I would rather people be honest about which claims they're still holding and not holding anymore. and still leave room for a conversation about how we treat our brothers and sisters inside the church and the wrongs that have been done, but leave the truth claims for another conversation. Don't conflate the two, because that is deeply confusing for a lot of people. The other thing that throws me with this leave loud movement is the loud part. And this is where it gets difficult. There are times to leave churches, like you and I have said. And I think especially if you're leaving a church over something you feel is unbiblical, especially if you have close relationships with leaders in that church, or you've been there for a long time, or you have a lot invested in that church, I absolutely think you should bring that to the authorities there. You should be sharing with them your concerns, because if you think something unbiblical is happening, you owe that to the other people in the pews. You don't want them to be led astray either. I absolutely think you should share that. Now, do you go on Twitter then and write a 40-tweet rant about what that particular church did wrong? Is that the correct way to be loud? I can't be convinced it is. That feels manipulative, and it feels like twisting a knife a little bit.
I'll say it stronger.
It
doesn't feel manipulative. It is. It's. Yeah. There's not a there's a real problem of people grieving out loud, or emoting out loud. And look, I've seen it in my own family this past year over COVID, where a family member chose to do that on social media. It's egregious. It's awful. And if it's wrong, by the way, for a family member, it's also wrong for a church family member.
This has been a really heavy conversation, and we just need to, it strikes me that we just need to be in prayer for our brothers and sisters. You brought up the other week when you and I were talking offline. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, if you think you're on sure footing, be careful lest you fall. And a lot of times, we look at people leaving churches or making bad decisions, and we say, gosh, what a terrible decision, what a terrible habit they're in, or whatever. And we can, we're like Peter, and we're like, I would never do that, Lord. I know I'm sinful generally, but I would never do that. And I think it's humbling and good to remember that God holds on to whom he will hold on to. And you and I just need to continue praying that our brothers and sisters, and that you and I would be in that fold, that he would hold on to us, that he wouldn't let us be drawn astray by cares of the world or by troubles, like he talks about in the parable with the weeds. And it's by the grace of God that he does hold on to us. And that's all the more reason, too, to hold on to our habits, our good habits, like meeting together and reading the word and praying and meditating on the word. Because, good habits like that breed belief, and bad habits, I think, breed unbelief. And so it's just a good reminder to stay humble in that area. So, John, now we're going to move into our time of recommendations. I have a really fun one for the week, so I'm going to go first.
Good. After that heavy program, let's lighten things up.
I know.
Man.
So
Jeez.
I was so excited this past week because episode 1 of the season 2 of The Chosen aired on Easter night. And I'm such a huge fan of this show. So we've talked about it a lot at Breakpoint. And by the way, you can find our commentaries and other resources and lots of great content at breakpoint.org. So head over there if you haven't already. You'll also be able to find notes from today, as well as links to the stories that we've been talking about. But we've talked about The Chosen before at Breakpoint. And there's beefs to be had with it. Some of the acting isn't as great as you'd hope, and that there's some cheesiness to it. But the thing I love most about it, I think, is that, first of all, it so far has stayed very true to Scripture. The stories that you see feel very scriptural, and stories that are extra biblical are usually, they're working toward a Bible story. So it's maybe giving you some creative context for something that did happen.
Yeah, they're not maybe a way to say it is they're not carrying the weight of the theological point or the point that the story's trying to make. It's basically trying to kind of give a little additional shape to the narrative. Nobody's going to bat 1,000.
Right.
No one's going to bat 1,000 on this one, but they do pretty well.
They do, and it's really fun to watch. And also, the other thing I love about it is it doesn't feel emotionally manipulative. They're not using like really sweeping music tracks and like long glances between characters. It just I think they allow the biblical story to speak for itself. And of course, I'm crying at the end of every episode, but it's just really beautifully done and really fun to watch. So I recommend it highly. So season 2 started on Sunday, and I think they're releasing new episodes every week. So, and you have to watch it on the Chosen app. So look for the Chosen app and you can find it there.
You can also find it on YouTube, actually, if you look it up. So if you need to find it there. But yeah, you stole my recommendation. That was going to be a recommendation.
Yes, I'm so glad I went first. Okay,
yeah,
your
there
turn.
you go. You didn't even ask. You just generally led with it.
Why don't you just recommend pour over coffee? I know that you demanded it this morning. So
I did not demand it. It was offered to me, and I gladly took it because the other coffee really was bad. So I made fun of Sean McDowell, but I'll give him thanks for creating some runway here so I could have good coffee in the middle of Georgia. I'm tempted also then to just use this to recommend programs like Impact 360, Summit Ministries. We're heading into a time of the summer where a lot of parents, I think, are thinking about kind of after school, but then others are thinking about, what happens, how do I prepare my kids for when they're out of the house? And there's just some remarkable organizations like Summit Ministries, like Worldview Academy, like the Impact 360 Institute programs. Some are gap years, some are 2-week camps, some are 1-week, conferences. They come in various shapes and sizes, but what they have in common is a willingness to take seriously kids' questions, to put truth in the context of relationship. I know that's actually Summit Ministries' kind of theme, and they do a great job of it. Just being here again in Pine Mountain, Georgia, at Impact 360 to teach it what is a gap year program, just to see where these 18 and 19-year-olds are compared to where most 18 and 19-year-olds are. There's a reason that so many colleges and universities like gap years because of the maturity, that additional year of maturity. And when you put kids in a crucible like this one, where they have leadership experience, they have theological expectations and study expectations, they have, they're in a context where they can talk about things that ultimately matter with other people their same age, but not be kind of brought down to the level of the trivial. There's just a lot there to really be grateful for, and these are difficult things because we know right now that all of higher education, and I don't just mean colleges and universities, I mean anything extra, institutional, I guess, or outside of the normal process costs a lot of money, and the typical university degree, it's hard to justify the cost benefit, terms of what you invest versus what you get back. And so to add these other things seems a little troubling. And I get it, but I just think that the investment is absolutely worth it because there's so many of these programs out here that are doing such great work, and I'm grateful to be a part of a lot of them. So if you've got a high school kid, junior, senior, you're thinking about, okay, are they really ready for a freshman year? What can I do to help prepare them for the ideas that they're going to face? How can I get them in a context where there's other Christians their age that care versus don't care? There's a whole list of these programs. Just Google Summit Ministries, Google Impact 360 Institute, Google Worldview Academy. They have them in different shapes and sizes. That's what's so great about these programs. There's different links, different programs. So that's my recommendation, is check those out.
That's really cool. That was off the cuff. That's impressive, John. That's great. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. And just one more slight recommendation. I just want to encourage all of us, and I'm encouraging myself as well, to pray for one another. Pray for all of the people, all the stories we talked about today, like John said, are really heavy. People just need prayer. People who are leaving church need prayer. Churches need prayer. Kids who are struggling with their gender identity need prayer. Legislators in Georgia need prayer. People who are upset about legislation in Georgia needs prayer. Everybody needs prayer. Just be praying for one another this week. Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, our esteemed president. We'll be back next week with more. We're so glad you could join us. Thanks.